Once everybody gets in. Well, thank you so much. I'm Alicia Barnes. I'm a news anchor here locally for ABC News, and we have spoken about so many of the issues under the umbrella of criminal justice reform today. Now we're going to talk about the solutions. In this next 20 minutes, it might get heated. It's my job to kind of moderate. Everybody does not agree. We're going to take on some of the issues you've heard. First off, let's start off with Dr. Ben Carson spoke about officers knowing their communities. Oliver is on the end here. First, I'm going to have you introduce yourselves. Let me back up first. Janae, go ahead and start.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janae Ingram. I'm the National Executive Director for National Action Network, a civil rights organization with President and founder Reverend Al Sharpton.
Thank you for having me. I'm James Flowers. I'm a former senior special agent with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. I'm also a candidate for sheriff here in Richland County. I'm a father of two, husband, and I'm cold. It's freezing in here.
It is.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Malia Cohen. I'm one of the elected members on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. It's my first time here to Columbia, South Carolina. Beautiful city. Thank you very much for welcoming me. I served for the last 5 years on this body, and I look forward to having a robust discussion about policy and how we can begin to implement some changes.
And good afternoon, I'm Oliver Gilbert. I'm the mayor of Miami Gardens, which is in South Florida. It is much colder here than it is there now. I'm just the mayor of my hometown and the father of an 8-year-old who wants to make a world that's going to be perfect for him. Thank you for having me.
And I think the best line of the day was when Ashley Bell said, we need to sift out the wrong and elevate the good. So that's really why we're here. We're going to be able to figure out how we tackle some of these problems. I did go into what Dr. Ben Carson was talking about in terms of knowing your police officers. So I want to ask you, Oliver, do black people want to go into law enforcement?
Absolutely. I mean, the black people I know, and maybe I just know different black people. But I'm the mayor of a city that's the largest predominantly black city in the state of Florida, actually south of Atlanta. 110,000 people. We put out a call for law enforcement. We went to hire our residents. And yes, there are a lot of black people, a lot of black young people who want to go into law enforcement. A lot of the impediments to going to law enforcement are things like to become certified. You have to have a good credit score. Mm-hmm. Well, look, I joked with someone yesterday that I'm the mayor of my city, a member of the Florida Bar, but I don't have a good enough credit score to be a police officer in my city. And that's real because I have student loans and I have bills and I struggled. Well, that's a lot of people's testimony. Mm-hmm. And so we need to really evaluate the actual impediments that actually becoming a police officer, going into law enforcement.
Right. Let's talk about the over-policing that Bernie Sanders brought up. James, if you want to handle that one.
Well, law enforcement itself is predominantly a white male business. If you look around police departments, local departments, county, state, white males basically make up the vast majority of the force. And what happens is law enforcement leaders, executives, sheriffs, police chiefs tend to over-police black, brown, and poor communities. And what happens is when you have a lot of white males in a predominantly black area, then you will inherently have conflict. And it's mainly because of the lack of understanding for each other that causes some of that conflict. And, people like to say that they police those areas because there's a lot of crime in those areas. But, if you look at it a little bit closer, maybe they're finding a lot of crime because there's a lot of police in that area. And so, you have to look at it both ways, and you'll come to a better conclusion than just over-policing our area.
Right. Let's talk about the solution now. We have mentioned Spring Valley High School, and I've covered that locally. It's a national news story where, again, the officer assaulted the student, happening again. Let's talk about the obnoxious behavior that people are now talking about that we need to really figure out. What do we mean when we talk about obnoxious behavior, and what do we do?
Right. So first off, here in South Carolina, for those of you that are not from here, we have a law that is called the Disturbing Schools Law. And one of the problems with that law is that it is, I like to call it, specifically ambiguous. And in its definition, it basically says that obnoxious behavior by a student is criminal. And so the problem with that is the person or people who determines what is obnoxious behavior. A student who cuts class is obnoxious behavior. A student who talks on their phone is obnoxious behavior, and that should be criminal. So when I look at it, and I spoke with the school board specifically, I told them that when they develop their policies or procedures on when to bring a law enforcement officer into the classroom, they should look at it like this. If the action by the student in the classroom is not a crime on the street, then it should not be a crime in the classroom. Right. And so if they look at it like that, use administrators, use teachers for discipline, but criminal action in the classroom should look completely different.
And the reason why, too, that's such a big issue is here you have a student at Spring Valley High School, did not break the law. I mean, she did not listen to a police officer, but she didn't break the law. And now that person has a record. And now in this case, it went now where they don't have money to get an attorney. And now their child has a record for not even breaking the law. Let's talk about that, because that's happening.
Actually, I agree with you. There's a critical problem. There's our children being raised in an environment where you're taught, if you talk to the police or you have a healthy relationship with the police or any law enforcement, that you're considered a snitch. I think we need to depart from that cultural way of thinking. Also, we need to be paying attention to the cultural norms that are around us. How do we deal with this in San Francisco? Well, we are doing a lot more in terms of providing services and addressing some of the trauma and realizing that people are what some might consider acting out in class as a result of some other underlying issues. Mm-hmm. And we need to be thoughtful on how we are approaching this and addressing these problems. Answering the question by giving these children or interfacing these children or calling the law enforcement at first blush is not the right answer at all.
Mm-hmm. And when do you decide to call a school resource officer into the class? When would you say that you do that? Because I feel like if a teacher can't have control of his class, and you call a resource officer that then wants to put a charge on the student, that's not helping the problem.
I think also the approach also includes the type of teachers. We need teachers that are culturally competent, teachers that are rooted in the culture of the students that they're teaching, teachers that are living in the community. It's not just law enforcement that need to live in the community, but teachers, paraprofessionals, nurses, doctors, first responders. I mean, we need to really get back to our core. If you're going to serve, you must know intimately the challenges and the circumstances and the family structure that these people that you're looking to serve are living under.
Janae, you wanted to say something?
I was actually going to go back to the earlier point talking about how do we prevent this from happening. And so I think part of it is being engaged in what's happening in your community. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday as we were prepping for this panel. Understanding what laws are being passed. Because if you didn't know that the Disturbing Schools was a law, mm-hmm. As a parent of a child, you would have been surprised to then find out that your child is now being arrested for doing something that wasn't necessarily a crime. And so understanding that as a community, we all have responsibilities.
How do people find out about that? I mean, if you went to Spring Valley High School, how would I as a parent know, you know what, let's look and see what the laws are, what the laws aren't, and what applies to my child? Is that
well, I think it's being engaged in the school board, with the school board, and understanding what policies the school board has, understanding what legislation is coming up. As National Action Network, we put out action alerts all the time where we have chapters, they're informed and engaged on these issues. So there are a lot of issues, and I know it can be overwhelming, but you have an obligation to stay informed because these laws are ultimately impacting us.
Mm-hmm. There's also an obligation just to have policies that make sense. Right. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Look,
Give us examples. Give people examples so they can understand.
You're criminalizing a child using her phone, and you've essentially criminalized using the phone. You've criminalized being disobedient. Right now, if we had the type of laws and law enforcement specifically that we have today, back when I was at school, I'd be a felon probably. I mean, we all got in fights. We all were disobedient. Newsflash, students, children are disobedient sometimes. The reason why we treat them differently is because they haven't learned to fully cope with the stress of life. So we need to take a step back and just make sure policy actually makes sense.
And one point I want to bring up is there might be a policy in a school that you can't use a cell phone. So if the incident happened in Spring Valley High School that happened here in Columbia, South Carolina, and students couldn't have their cell phones, then it's not recorded. So what kinds of actions are going on, and you make the student feel like you don't even have anything to be able to record this, to say, hey, look, mom and dad, this is what I had to deal with today.
You know, there's also something that we're doing on the ground in San Francisco is educating our young people on their rights, what legally they are required to information to share when a law enforcement stops them. What are the parameters? Do they should they feel uncomfortable or threatened? What are some of the things that they need to say to protect themselves so that they are not finding themselves on the opposite side of the law? But it's absolutely critical that we educate our young kids, particularly our boys, so they know what how to handle themselves.
Right. Right.
I do want to. We also need to educate police officers, and there's something called implicit bias training.
Okay.
And we really need to take an opportunity to help law enforcement professionals address things that they might not even acknowledge as bigotry. They might not know that if you see a young black man running down the street, you think he's done something, but if you see a young white man, you think he's jogging. They might not realize that. They might not realize that they've assumed something based on all the movies they've seen and the news broadcasts and the books and everything they've heard and the rap songs. They have that embedded in them. And it's not just in them.
Hey, implicit bias training, like is that something that you've ever seen?
Absolutely. Police officers know what's right and wrong. Yeah, the training that police officers receive at the Criminal Justice Academy here in Columbia, South Carolina, specifically tell them, for example, Spring Valley incident specifically. The law enforcement officer knew exactly that his actions was excessive, okay? Use of force in law enforcement is unfortunate, but sometimes necessary. Excessive use of force is never acceptable and it's always criminal. And so, you know, when this officer comes in, my biggest problem is, why was he so comfortable to come into that classroom with administrators, teachers, other students, and use the amount of force that he used on a child? And
comfortable to me means you've done it before.
He's done it before, and he was not afraid of the consequences or ramifications from his leadership. So at the end of the day, law enforcement officers on the street follow the lead of their leaders. If they set a tone of violence, of bias, of you know, preying upon certain people, then that's exactly what the people.
Or even if they excuse it.
Or if they excuse it. Exactly.
Or hire people who have a proven record of having that sort of behavior.
Which, under the umbrella of criminal justice reform, means investigating your department. I mean, I think that's a big issue. When you have a case like we're seeing around the world, and an officer gets on camera and says, we are investigating it. Well, that means you're investigating yourself. Right. Explain that so people can understand how that is not going to win and yield what's really going on.
So in the world of transparency, you should not be investigating yourself, because you will never do a good job. I can tell you right now, I didn't do anything wrong before I even started my investigation into myself, okay? So you need outside investigators. And what happens is, let's take an officer-involved shooting, for example. If the agency of the officer does the investigation, the officer is interviewed by investigators from his own agency. That officer now feels compelled to speak, which is contrary to their rights under the Fifth Amendment. And so, you know, you don't have to say anything in a criminal investigation to an investigator, but if you do to your own people, then you feel compelled to speak. When they go to court, all they have to do is tell the judge, hey, you know, I felt I had to speak or I'd get fired. And so you basically just built in a built-in defense.
So you're saying if the system across the board was, we have an outside, independent investigation, that's more the solution.
Right. There's no bias. You know, there have been shootings in the Midlands area where a certain person would get on TV directly after the shooting and say, hey, my officer felt he was threatened, his life was in danger, and he did the right thing. And then bring his own investigators in right after he just cleared the officer on the news. What type of objective investigation is the investigator going to do?
How do we change that in all of our communities, like not just here in South Carolina?
Can I just jump in? Because I want to say, I think the other part of that we're not touching on is to go a step further and also include a special prosecutor.
Okay.
That's the
Yes.
next step, and that's something that National Action Network has been promoting. We have put it in our reports to the 21st Century Task Force on Policing. And I think ultimately the close relationship between prosecutors and the police department prevent, again, a full and accountable investigation, that we need to encourage that there be a state prosecutor. And I know we talked a little bit about that yesterday.
Oliver?
Yeah, I would take it a step further, because we wait until we're in the heat of these moments and everyone's reacting emotionally. We need to look at the laws under which these investigations will be had. Because really, and I'll give the example in Florida. In Florida, there, like most states, there's a officer's Bill of Rights. Well, an officer is cannot be compelled to give a statement until the investigation is completely finished. You've shown him all of the evidence. He's had an opportunity to review it with his attorney, and then he just has to reconcile his version of events or her version of events with the evidence that was presented. That's the process that's going to take place. So a lot of times we find ourselves reacting emotionally to tragedies, but we don't sit down and intellectually address the policy that will never allow people to be held accountable. If you really want people to be accountable, it's not after someone's killed. It's before, when we sit down and say, as a citizen, as a community of good, well, forward-thinking people, how do we want these situations addressed? And I'm going to pick up one of Janae's terms, actually vote for people. Actually vote for people. Actually, you ask them a question and vote for them based on what they say they're going to do, not a platitude. Not, everybody should be treated fairly. Well, okay, yeah, that's true. How do we ensure that? That's what we call due process.
Right.
How do we ensure that? We get to determine that by electing people.
Okay, we're running out of time, and I do want to get to sentencing reform. I mean, this is a big issue. You're hearing a lot about this now. Janae, explain so people can understand what it is and your thoughts on how we move forward.
So sentencing reform is basically addressing mandatory minimums that exist, and really how we sentence people for crimes. It happens on the state level and the federal level. Right now, there are bills that are being debated in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, that will address some of these sentencing disparities and issues that we see, specifically mandatory minimums. I will say that they're a first step. They're not the whole thing. Many of the legislation that are out there still have mandatory minimums in it, which is an issue that we, ultimately, I think there's a lot of bipartisan support that this is something that needs to be amended. The other part of sentencing reform that doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention are alternative programs or diversionary programs, fines, community service, to address why we are criminalizing and sentencing people to jail when there are other means of rehabilitation.
Explain those so people can, or James, if you want to chime in, anybody, Malia?
We've done something in Miami Gardens, that's Miami Gardens, Florida, home of Jazz in the Gardens, which is March 19th and 20th. That was a plug. We've done something, and you know what, you'll see municipalities start to take the lead and stuff because the state and the federal government is real slower acting, where we've essentially given our officers the ability to write a ticket for possession of marijuana instead of criminalizing it, because just quite frankly, look, there are too many people. I don't know that it's a gateway drug. It is a gateway crime. Once you are on probation, once you're in the system, it's just a problem. So we don't want to be in the business of doing that. We want people to be able to live their life as free as possible, with this caveat: it can't interfere with other people living their lives. That's what we learned when we were in kids in social studies. So just leave them alone.
We are almost out of time, and I do want to ask this question. I'm going to ask you individually. The overall question is, what advice do you have for people as we're going into an election for next year, picking a candidate under the umbrella of criminal justice reform? What advice do you have? What kind of questions do you think they should be able to ask and look for? Oliver, if you want to start, talk about if you were a senior citizen out there listening right now, what questions do you need to be thinking about as you pick a candidate?
What their plan is specifically, but also, step back for a moment and think about the things you did as a child. Think about the system you wanted to grow up in, and then try to build that system for the children that are going to grow up. For generations, Americans have paid it forward. They tried to build something that was going to last, not just for them, but for people and generations to come. We need to do that. I need them to do that. So when they're picking a candidate, sure, ask the questions about Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security, but also ask the questions about education and building capacity in our system that will allow children to dream their way and dream this country into a brighter future. We do that, and we fix that, and we allow a child to dream. And we build a system that's fair, and I promise you, will imprison fewer people.
Malia?
Some advice that I would give to mothers in particular,
Single
mothers
parents.
or single mothers in particular, is I would say always question, be active and be engaged, be present, pay attention. Not only are you talking to your child, but you're also talking to your child's teacher, you're talking to the elected officials and the advocates. On this body here, you've got elected officials here, you have law enforcement, and you have an advocate. Collectively, we make up the community, and collectively, we all move the agenda forward.
James, do you have a comment?
Well, yeah. Take the time to come out to forums like this, look the candidate in their eye, ask them what they think the actual problems are, exactly how they're going to fix what those problems are, and how that's going to affect you directly. And that's my sense.
Janae, we have 15 seconds. If you are a college student or a millennial.
I would say there's some data out that shows that younger people are profiled more. So whether it's racial profiling or transgender profiling, or even Islamophobia, which we know is a real hot button issue right now, I would say to them, if there's an act, a specific act, there's the End Racial Profiling Act. Would the next president, sign that into law if it passed his or her desk? That would be my one tangible thing.
All right. I thank you to the panel for being here. Hopefully
Thank
you guys
you.
enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Let's give it a big round of applause. Thank you.